Did you know that the Madeleine McCann case could have taken a completely different turn? On the night of her disappearance, a series of mistakes and confusing decisions turned everything into chaos. These crucial details may have sealed Madeleine's fate forever, and few people realized how important they were. If you also believe that every detail matters in unraveling mysteries like this one, subscribe to the channel now and activate the notification bell. Together, we will explore the points that many overlook, and who knows, take a step closer to the truth. On the day Madeleine McCann disappeared, it seemed that everything was in a fragile balance, ready to collapse at any moment. Jerry McCann, when checking on the children around 9:05 p.m., found everything seemingly normal. However, there was one unsettling detail. The bedroom door was ajar. He adjusted the door but did not investigate further. Perhaps because he trusted the safety of the place, or perhaps because he believed it was just a coincidence. But it was in that small moment that something crucial went unnoticed, something that would later be questioned countless times. Meanwhile, Jane Tanner, a friend of the McCanns, was walking back to the restaurant and saw a man carrying a child wrapped in a blanket. It was a sight that didn't seem out of the ordinary at first glance. Perhaps it was a guest going to put their child to sleep. Jane did not mention the incident to the group at that time, but the decision not to immediately mention what she saw would change the course of the entire narrative. Could that man have been the missing piece to unravel the disappearance? Or was this clue, like so many others, swallowed by the ensuing chaos? Around 10 p.m., Kate returned to the apartment and found Madeleine's bed empty. The window was open, the curtains fluttering in the wind, and the silence in the room was deafening. Panic set in immediately. Her scream, "They took her!" echoed through the resort. But what happened next was a succession of decisions that compromised any possibility of an accurate investigation. The apartment turned into a scene of confusion. Friends, resort staff, and neighbors entered, touched objects, messed with the curtains, walking back and forth in search of any clue. But each movement inadvertently erased marks, eliminated traces, destroyed evidence. Outside, time was running against them. Authorities were called, but the response was slow. The local police took hours to arrive at the scene, and when they did, they found a completely contaminated scene. There were no roadblocks on nearby roads, no communication with borders or airports. The window of time to track a possible kidnapper was rapidly closing, and each minute lost made it harder to undo the damage. Meanwhile, what should have been the reconstruction of the night's events became a labyrinth of inconsistencies. Who saw what and when? The group's testimonies began to show gaps that were never filled. Jane Tanner, when she finally mentioned the man she saw carrying a child, brought important information, but now the question was another. Why did no one else see him? Did he go unnoticed, or was he simply ignored? Or worse, was he just a distraction while something much bigger, which could have clarified doubts, were not analyzed in a timely manner? Some footage was lost, others were never recovered. Crucial details were out of the authorities' reach due to sheer disorganization. The failure to use these basic investigative tools in that initial moment created more questions than answers. At the same time, attention began to turn to the McCanns themselves. The media, hungry for culprits, shone the spotlight on the couple. Minor behaviors were exaggerated, words were distorted, and soon, instead of investigating concrete possibilities, resources were being used to create narratives against the parents. This diverted focus from other lines of investigation that could have offered real answers. What happened that night was not just the disappearance of a child, but the collapse of an entire system. Protocols that should have been followed were ignored. The disappearance scene was treated as a commonplace place. In the first 24 hours, the most crucial in any kidnapping investigation, turned into a period of irreparable loss. Looking back, every decision made that night seemed to push the truth further away. And what remained were not just unanswered questions, but a feeling that everything could have been different if the steps had been taken the right way. That day, marked by confusion and decisions that still leave questions in the air today, everything seemed to be happening in a strange and disconnected sequence. When Kate McCann found Madeleine's bed empty and the window open, the panic that took over her was instantaneous. But what happened next, what seemed to be a desperate mother's search, ended up creating the chaos that would compromise the entire investigation. Every movement at that critical moment carried a weight that no one understood at the time. As Kate shouted, "They took her!" throughout the resort, friends and staff began to crowd the apartment. And here arises the first major point of contradiction. Why did no one think to preserve the scene as it was? Objects were moved, curtains touched, and the movement on the site eliminated any chance of preserving important clues. A detail that could have changed everything was discovered later. The fingerprints on the open window were incomplete, as if they were partially erased during that initial confusion. This raises an essential question. Did the kidnapper manipulate something to disguise their intentions? Or was it the actions of the people themselves trying to help that destroyed the evidence? Shortly after, Jane Tanner finally revealed to the group that she had seen a man carrying a child wrapped in a blanket. This information, which could have been a game changer, was received with less urgency than necessary. The police, when informed hours later, could not trace the suspect's possible route. The time lost here was vital, but the most surprising came days later. Contradictory testimonies from other guests cast doubt on Jane's own account. One of them claimed to have been on the same path at that time and saw no one. Did Jane really see what she thought she saw? Or was her memory influenced by the tension of that night? The security cameras, which should have recorded movements around the resort, were neglected in one of the investigation's biggest mistakes. Some were not working, others had their footage analyzed too late, and those that could contain useful information were never released to the public. A detail that is rarely mentioned. A camera positioned at one of the exit gates recorded suspicious movements between 9 p.m. and 10 p.m., but the recordings disappear before midnight. Was this a technical problem or something more sinister? This failure fueled theories that the resort's very structure could have facilitated the crime. Another critical moment occurred when the police began interrogating the McCanns and their friends, which should have been a chance to organize a clear timeline. But the testimonies contradicted each other on fundamental details, such as the exact times of checking on the children. Jerry stated he had checked the children at 9:05 p.m. and saw nothing wrong, but Matt Oldfield, another friend of the group, said he went to the apartment at 9:30 p.m. and did not enter the room, only heard comfortable silence. This time interval, which should have been clarified with precision, remains a void full of possibilities. Was Madeleine still in the apartment, or had she already been taken? Even more intriguing was the delay in calling in child kidnapping specialists. The Portuguese police, who were not used to handling such cases, made mistakes that cost dearly. The scene was not immediately secured, the searches in the surroundings began too late, and the information was not quickly shared with international authorities. Even the searches with sniffer dogs, which could have been crucial, only started days later, when Madeleine's trail was already cold. The impact of media pressure at that moment. Journalists from all over the world arrived at the site, turning the case into a spectacle that further complicated the investigation. The focus shifted to the McCanns as suspects, a narrative fueled both by speculation and the couple's minor slip-ups. An example of this was Kate's behavior during the initial interviews, which some interpreted as cold or distant. These interpretations, based more on public perception than on concrete facts, diverted attention from what truly mattered. Looking back, every detail of that night seems laden with a gravity that, at the time, was ignored or minimized. If the scene had been secured, if the cameras had been analyzed at the right moment, if Jane Tanner's information had received more immediate attention, could Madeleine's fate have been different? These questions remain unanswered, but they make it clear that the chaos of that night was not just the result of a crime, but of a succession of human errors that shaped the case as we know it today. That night, as chaos began to spread throughout the resort, the initial minutes of Madeleine McCann's disappearance became a mosaic of doubts and hasty actions. What should have been a coordinated response ended up generating a series of confusing events that, instead of helping, buried crucial information under a sea of speculations. And here is where one of the main theories begins to gain strength. Could the failure in communication between the group and the authorities have been the main catalyst for the loss of control? The first major question arises with the call to the police. Kate McCann screamed for help at 10:10 p.m., but the official contact with the authorities was made only about 40 minutes later. What happened during this interval? According to later testimonies, the group of friends opted to search for Madeleine on their own before alerting the authorities. This decision, even if made in desperation, raises a crucial doubt. Did this disorganized search contaminate the scene or eliminate traces that could have been key to understanding what really happened? Some believe that the McCanns and their friends intended to help, but ended up inadvertently sabotaging the investigation itself. When the Portuguese police arrived at the scene, the situation was already out of control. There were more than 20 people inside and around the apartment. Resort staff, the couple's friends, and even other guests were called to help in the search. This caused objects to be moved, fingerprints to be erased, and any possible direct evidence of the crime to be rendered useless. Imagine a puzzle where the pieces have been mixed, some lost, and others completely destroyed. This initial contamination is one of the most criticized points by case experts because it reinforces a bitter truth. Chaos compromised any chance of an accurate analysis of the scene. Another element that stands out is the behavior of the group of friends. They decided to create a timeline of events, noted on a piece of paper, to assist the police. But there is a problem. This timeline is full of contradictions. For example, Jane Tanner claimed to have seen a man carrying a child at 9:15 p.m., but Jerry McCann, who was in the same location at the same time, stated he saw nothing suspicious. How is this possible? Is someone confused, or is something else happening? These inconsistencies further fueled doubts about the credibility of the testimonies and subsequently turned the group itself into targets of suspicion. And then we reach the issue of security cameras. One of the most discussed theories is that the resort had several strategically positioned cameras, but none of them recorded relevant movements that night. Some were turned off, while others didn't even have functional angles to capture possible suspicious exits or entrances. This absence of visual records creates a void that is filled with speculations. Was it negligence or something more intentional? Some critics suggest that the resort might have been trying to avoid negative exposure by not providing all the footage to the authorities. But perhaps the most controversial point of that night is the behavior of the local police. The National Republican Guard, which was the first to arrive at the scene, did not immediately secure the area and treated the disappearance as a routine occurrence, not as a possible kidnapping. The judicial police, responsible for more complex investigations, were only called in hours later. This caused precious time to be wasted. To make matters worse, there was evident tension between the Portuguese police and the British investigators who arrived to help with the case. This rivalry resulted in delays, rework, and confused communication. It is possible that valuable information was lost in the process, burying clues that could have revealed what really began to arrive en masse. The disappearance of a British girl at a European resort quickly became headline news worldwide. And here is another delicate point. Did the press pressure hinder more than help? With cameras and microphones focused on every move of the McCanns, the case narrative began to split. Some reports focused on the desperate search for the girl, while others began to question the couple's actions, with insinuations that they could be involved. This duality in the media narrative not only complicated the investigation, but also created a storm of misinformation that continues to this day. As the night progressed, a sense of helplessness began to take over. Madeleine disappeared within such a short time window, estimated between 9:05 p.m. and 10 p.m., that many believe everything was planned with precision. But this precision, ironically, was not accompanied by the initial response, which should have been swift and coordinated. The sum of impulsive decisions, structural failures, and the lack of preparedness to handle such a delicate situation ended up turning what could have been an organized search into a chaotic scenario. And here is the big question. Was what happened that night the result of simple human errors, or was there something bigger at play? What is clear is that chaos was the true protagonist of the first hours after Madeleine's disappearance, and it's impossible not to wonder. If everything had been done differently, would we have a clear answer today about what happened? The confusion and mistakes of that night were, in themselves, enough to compromise any investigation. But what few know is that days later, a crucial detail emerged from the shadows, something so simple that it almost went unnoticed. A resort employee in charge of maintenance revealed that there was something strange in the team's records that night. He mentioned a recent repair on a window that coincided exactly with the McCann's apartment. According to him, the service had been completed 2 days before the disappearance, but the window's security system was still malfunctioning. Here is the intriguing point. The window was the same one that, the morning after the disappearance, was found slightly open, with its blinds misaligned. During the initial testimonies, Kate McCann stated that this window was completely closed when she left Madeleine to sleep. However, the Portuguese police claimed there were no signs of forced entry. This opens up a frightening possibility. Did the kidnapper use the window's vulnerability to enter the apartment without leaving obvious traces? Or did someone with internal access to the resort know about this defect and take advantage of the situation to commit the crime? This discovery leads to a twist in the case. During the initial investigations, the McCanns and their friends had been questioned about how it was possible that no one had heard anything abnormal that night. Madeleine was in a ground-floor apartment close to the street with relatively easy access for anyone wanting to break in. And here comes a new piece of information. Witnesses later reported seeing a man standing near the area where the apartment was, smoking, and looking restless. This description was largely ignored in the official reports because, at the time, it was believed that anyone near the resort could just be a guest or an employee. But crossing this information with the window defect, a new line of reasoning emerges. What if that person was there observing, waiting for the right moment to act? The theory gained even more strength when, weeks later, a guest claimed to have found an unusual object near the apartment, a piece of fabric that seemed to have been used to wrap something or someone. This was handed over to the authorities but mysteriously disappeared from the official reports. This absence generated a wave of speculations, with some believing it was a key piece that could have connected the suspect to a possible getaway vehicle. Others, however, argue that it might have been just a mistake, any item discarded by a guest. But how can something so important simply disappear without explanations? Furthermore, a detail that was buried in the records surfaced years later. On the night of the disappearance, the resort's access control system experienced a failure. Digital entry cards, which should have recorded who entered and exited each apartment, showed no abnormal activity in the McCann's apartment. Apparently, this was enough to dismiss the idea that someone had used a card to enter. However, later experts argued that it was possible to bypass the system manually, especially if the person knew where the failure points were. And who would have access to this kind of information except someone with a direct connection to the resort? Testimony, one of the resort's employees stated that he saw a person carrying a large plastic bag towards a vehicle parked near the complex in the early morning hours after the disappearance. Although it sounds suspicious, this information was initially ignored because, at the time, it was believed that any movement during the night was unrelated to the case. However, when cross-referencing this description with the guest report of finding the fabric near the apartment, a disturbing connection begins to emerge. Who was this person? And why didn't anyone ask more questions? These points make it clear that the case is full of pieces that never fit and perhaps never will. The negligence in treating every small piece of evidence as potentially crucial created a domino effect, where details that could have been thoroughly investigated simply disappeared in the chaos of the first hours. Now, with these new angles being considered, a darker question arises. What if all this was more than just disorganization? What if someone was counting on these failures to ensure that the truth never came to light? These questions not only deepen the mystery, but also show how the Madeleine McCann case is far from being resolved. By revisiting each seemingly insignificant detail, it becomes clear that there is much more behind that night than initially thought. Every new piece brings with it new questions, and possibly a new secret waiting to be discovered. With so many neglected points and possible failures right from the start, it's impossible to ignore the devastating impact of the decisions made that night. The malfunctioning window, the ignored reports, the disappearance of evidence. All of this not only hindered the investigation, but also created a permanent shadow over the case. In my opinion, more than mistakes, there was a collective failure to treat every detail with the urgency and seriousness it deserved. Every omission, intentional or not, contributed to the silence that surrounds the truth about what happened to Madeleine. And here is something for you to reflect on. Are we facing a series of human errors or something much more calculated? For me, the absence of answers doesn't mean they don't exist, but that they might be hidden by hands that have much to lose. This is one of those cases that challenges us to never give up seeking the truth, even when everything seems lost. If you want to continue diving into stories as complex and intriguing as this one, don't miss the next video. There we will discuss another key piece that could change your view of the entire case. If you've made it this far, comment. I am a guardian of the truth, so I know you followed every detail. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate notifications so you don't miss the next mystery. See you there.